Okay, we'll get started. Thank you everybody for joining. I think this is going to be a really fun webinar and you're going to get to learn a skill that hopefully you'll be able to use on your own projects. And so what we're going to be building out today is a QR code generator. So first and foremost, if you've never used QR codes before, what they are is they're essentially a digital or image-based representation of data and text. And so a lot of people think that there is some magic behind QR codes. Not really. All they are is a way of formatting an image so that cameras and different tools like that can read the image and can translate it into text. So one of the most common ways that you would use a QR code would be for something like, say you go to a restaurant and they have all of their menus are digital and you access the menu by holding your camera over the QR code, and then it opens up a link to a website. There wasn't anything magical happening with that. All that happened, and you're going to see that today, is that the URL for that website was embedded digitally into that image, and the camera was able to translate that to text. It doesn't have to just be a URL. It could be anything. A URL, though, is something that is probably one of the most common use cases for QR codes. So you can also see them, though, for things like being able to say redeem a coupon or a concert ticket or anything like that. And you can embed anything you want in that code. And so that's what we're going to do today. I have right now the final version of what we're going to be building out so you can see exactly what's possible with it. So say that I want to have DevCamp. I want to put a link direct to DevCamp. Right here, I can type the URL, and as you can see, as I'm typing, the code is actually changing dynamically, and you're going to see how you can build that. So with each character change, what is happening is the QR code is it's being generated. So all of this text right here is being translated into something that a camera can understand. So for that, I'm just going to hit return because this is a form that we're going to be building out, and it auto generates it and it downloads it. And we're going to be building all of this out. And you can see this is now on my hard drive. And if I open up my phone here and I hover over it, then it pops open a link and takes me straight to DevCamp. Probably can't see that, but trust me, that is what's happening. So that's what we're going to be building out. This is the final version that we have here. So we're going to switch to the starter. I'm going to include, and let me actually put here in the show notes, the link to the code, so to the starter and to the final version. So I'm going to put this in the show notes, and if you're watching right now live, then I'm placing this in the chat window so that you can access it. And so we have a couple branches here on GitHub. The starter branch is going to have the initial version of the code, and then the master branch is going to have the final version. And so you can reference those. Now, the library that we are going to be using is called qrcode.react. And I'll pop that open as well. I'll include that in the show notes and in the chat as well. And this is a very helpful React library that essentially does the translation for us. So it will take in the text, it's its own dedicated component that we can pass values to, and then you can grab those values. And one of the trickiest, most advanced things we're going to do over this next hour or so, however long that it's going to take to do this, is going to be being able to actually go into the generated HTML code, and we're going to be able to parse it and then auto download the image. So the trickiest part of what we just did right here, what you saw, was with this download functionality, because that's not native. That is something that we're going to have to extend and build out. So let's get started. I'm going to switch to Visual Studio Code here, and I'm going to switch over to the starter branch. and I will get started. So everything has already been installed. If you grab this code from GitHub, then you'll have to run npm install to grab the dependencies, and then you'll be able to follow along. So the objectives, what we're going to cover today is one, how to work with the QR code React library. Then we're going to see how we can build a component that generates that QR code for us. We're going to connect it directly into a form. So as we're typing in the form, it's going to be populating that QR code. Then we are going to see how we can customize some things like the styles and some things like that. And lastly, we're going to see how we can embed images. And I actually added one, which is to download the generated QR code. When I originally planned this webinar out, I wasn't sure if we were going to have time for that, but after building out the project, I think that we're going to be able to get to it. So here we are on the starter. I've simply imported that QR code component, and I've also brought in the DevCamp icon for when we get into actually embedding those. So first and foremost, we have a form here. This is a basic React form. And technically, you don't need a form for what we're doing. You could simply have an input tag. And as you're typing, it's grabbing that URL value. And then it is going to be passing that directly to the component. I built out a form because one thing I thought was kind of cool was as you're typing in that URL, you can, when you're using a form in React or in HTML or anything, you're able to use some helpful tools like hitting the return button to auto submit the form. So you could type in that URL, hit return, and it'll automatically download that image. So that's why I have it in a form, and I'm pointing that to a function that we're going to be building out. So this is to do, and that's what's going to download that QR code for us. So first, let's bring in the QR code library. So I'm going to create a dedicated function here, and I'm just going to call it QR code. It's not going to take in any arguments, and in fact, it's not even going to be a function. We'll just store it in a variable, and then we're going to call that QR code component. And then this component takes a number of props in. So the very first one that we're going to pass in is an ID. This technically isn't needed. I just like to use it as a reference point. So I'm going to do QR code ID, something like that. And then after that, let's put in a size. So for the size, this takes an integer value. And so for this, let's start off and we're going to do it at 500. Let me see really quick what TypeScript doesn't like here. Okay, ID. Okay, that's fine. We'll worry about that later. And then the value. For right now, before we even talk about connecting it into the form, let's just connect it to Google. And then we'll see how we can pass that directly in a little bit. We're going to pass in a background color. And this one's going to be white. Part of these are, some of these that I'm showing you are actually the defaults. You can see these in the documentation. I'm placing them here because I want you to see what's available to you. So you have complete control over the styles and different things like that. So say you wanted to create a really cool looking QR code that you were working for a client and they wanted to have one of their colors as a background color, and then the foreground color, which is actually like what all the little blocks are, they wanted that to be a different color. You can control that with this component. And so here we're going to do that. So I'm going to say foreground color. And I'll just say that that's black, but you can put in anything here. These are taking in the same type of styles that you would use for CSS. So I could do something like the hash symbol and then FFF or anything like that. And one thing that I've done on previous projects that's pretty cool is I've actually built out color pickers so that you can completely create a custom QR code from scratch on the fly. So somebody could have a color picker and say, okay, I want red to be the background color and I want some kind of black to be the foreground color. And they pick those values, set them, and then I just would tie that into a variable here, and then that would show up dynamically. The next one is level. Now with level, we have a number of items. And oh, I know what my issue is. I need to pick out the right component name. There we go. Okay, so with level, this is something, it's actually called the air level. So we have a few options here. H, L, M, and Q. I believe L is the default. I'm going to show you all of them though, so you can kind of see the differences between them. So I'm going to start with H, and then foreground color. There it goes, FG color, level, and then that's going to be it for right now. And then I simply have to pass this variable in where I had the placeholder. So curly brackets, that variable name, hit save, and now let's see what we have. And if I hit refresh, there we go. So right now, you can test this out. It's a little bit harder to test on the desktop, and so I'm just going to pull my phone out, hover it over, and see where it takes me. And yes, it took me right to Google. So that is working perfectly. So first and foremost, we got that going for us. I'm going to shrink this a little bit just so we can see the QR code by itself. And so when I make changes, you'll actually see them auto-populating here. There we go. Okay, so I talked about that level. This is called the air level, which means that there are different ways that you can configure the little blocks. And so maybe you're having to build something out that's pretty complex, and so you need to alter that air level. I've never actually had to do that in a real life scenario, but we can do it just so you can see that it changes what it looks like. So I could change it to M, and then it's going to get altered, and we're going to have a slightly different version. Same thing if you did it to Q. And so there you go. It's just kind of rearranging how they're set up. Usually you'd only have that issue if, say, you were building out a very advanced type QR code for, say, like your inventory scanner or something, and you had a ton of different options and they had a lot of data inside of them. You might need to play with that error code. And that's a reason why I included it in there. But you could actually leave this blank, and I'm pretty sure it defaults to L. I'll leave it at Q right here. And now let's see how we can actually grab this value. So we are setting the value in this input. So as I'm typing in that URL, it's filling it out. So all I have to do is in curly brackets for value, I can just pass in that URL. Let's hit save. And now if I start typing anything in, it doesn't have to be a URL, it can be anything. As you can see, it's now starting to change and it's updating. And as you can notice, the more I type in, the more complex that QR code gets, because each one of those little blocks represents a character that are linked to other ones. And that's how QR codes work just in general. So that is working nicely for us. So we have now connected the form, and technically, say you needed to build out this feature for a client and you had to build it very fast, what we did right now works. You're already done, which is really nice. In about 5 minutes, you're able to build out a QR code generator. You can obviously play with some of those things like the background color, and you can even do things like if you want to include margin. So I can say I want include margin to be true, and then I want this background color to be red. If I hit save now it's going to refresh, and you can see we have been able to customize those colors. I'm going to switch back because I want to use white and I don't want to include margin, but there are all kinds of really fun types of ways that you can work with this QR code component and pass in values. All their documentation has the list of each one of those available options that you can choose from. So we're now back to our white and black QR code. And now next, let's see how we can use images. So there is another option here, and it's called image settings. And this takes in a nested object. And so let me actually write it like this. So it takes in a nested object. the first argument is going to be source. So this is going to be the source of the image. And I already imported an icon up here that's it's stored inside of our static images directory. So I can simply pass that in. And then I'm going to call something called excavate. I'm going to set that to true. What that does is it kind of separates the blocks and it makes room for that image. And then lastly, I'm going to pass in the value, the size value for the image. So for the width, I'm going to say 500 times 0.1. So that's going to give us 10%. So if you're building out some type of dynamically sized component, so say that you had a gigantic form and you let this QR code be anything you wanted it to be. It could be 1,000 pixels wide. It could be 50 pixels wide. It could be any type of size you wanted. This image is going to dynamically change based on the value, because we're saying whatever the value is for the width, we want it to be 10%. And then we're going to do the exact same thing for the height. One thing to note here is you want to, whenever you're embedding an image in this QR code, you typically always want to work with perfectly square images. I've tried this before with ones that weren't square and they kind of get distorted. And sometimes if you do it improperly, it'll actually make it so the QR code doesn't work because that image is covering up too many of the blocks. So let's see, this should give us everything we need for that embedded image. And there we go. We have the little DevCamp logo embedded right in the middle of it. And I'm going to test this out just to make sure it works. So go to devcamp.com. Once again, pull out my phone and that popped it up and we're on DevCamp. So that is working nicely. So that image, that icon, especially when you use excavate, it doesn't get in the way of those characters and the phones are going to know exactly where to take the user. Okay, so we built out in a pretty short period of time a pretty cool little feature. Now let's go and let's move on to the most complex part of this system, and that is going to be how we can download the entire image. I'll give you one little caveat. Technically, we could do this ourselves by just right-clicking on the image and clicking Save Image As. So this is a dynamically generated image right now that the component created for us. So you could right-click on it, but by us learning how to do this, you're going to learn a lot about how React can interact with the DOM. And so with that document object model, and you're going to be able to learn some things that will hopefully help you with other projects and other features as well. So let's get started on that. So I'm going to get rid of this to-do comment here. And so the very first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to grab the canvas object. So I'm going to create a value called canvas, a variable called canvas. And then I'm now going to grab the image itself. Now, if you've never worked with React before, where you've had to go and grab elements on the page, it can be a little bit tricky. And the reason for that is because React creates what is called a virtual DOM. So if you were working on a regular static HTML and CSS website, what happens is that's just a document. It's a HTML document, and you have a set of tags and different attributes and values inside of those tags. And then browsers can understand that. With the way React works, React doesn't actually give you direct access to do things like select items and to work with the DOM, because that would hurt performance. So instead, what it does is it creates this virtual DOM. And so whenever we want to go and we want to interact with the elements on the page and grab their internal value. So we're essentially saying we're kind of almost, in a sense, bypassing React and we're digging into what got generated. We need to work with what is called a ref. And so I'm going to come up to the top here and I'm going to call or create an empty reference. And for this, I'll just call this my QR ref. And then that is going to use React. And we're going to use the use ref hook. And we're not going to pass any values into it. And then this is going to give us the ability to reach in and grab the actual nodes that are being generated here, almost kind of like we're working with a regular static website. We're going to bypass the virtual DOM that React created. And so we're going to pass this directly into one of these div elements. So this div that wraps up our QR code component, we're going to say that that div is going to have a ref. It's going to take in a ref prop of QR ref. And so this is going to give us that reference right to that DOM node so that we can now work with this the same way we would work if we were working directly in the browser with a static site. So now we can come back here and now we can actually call that ref. So I'm going to say I want to call my QR ref. And then I'm going to call the current value on that. So whenever you're working with refs, and I highly recommend, if you've never done this before, I'll include this in the show notes as well. React, use ref hook. Look at the documentation for the ref hook, because this is going to tell you all kinds of very cool things for how you can interact with those DOM elements, because there's going to be plenty of times where you're going to need to do this. A great example of this is, say you're building out an image uploader where you can go drag and drop images directly onto a form element, and then it uploads those to an API. Well, say that you wanted to empty out that form component when the upload was complete. The best way of doing that typically is by using a reference inside, grabbing the value, and then emptying it. And so by working with refs, you're able to get into some of the more advanced forms of React and be able to build out some pretty cool features. So we now have ref, and we're saying that we want the current value of that ref, and then we're going to use a query selector. So for this, we're going to say query selector, and we're going to pass in canvas. I'm going to use a TS ignore here so we don't get that little error warning from TypeScript. And so let's see exactly what we have here. And one of the easiest ways of doing this is actually inspecting this in the browser. So what exactly is inside of this component? Well, if you come and you inspect it, and I'll zoom in here, we're going to see that our QR container right here has inside of it a canvas tag. So a canvas tag is something in HTML that gives us the ability to essentially create content dynamically. And that's the way this component and many components like it work, is there is what's called a canvas, almost kind of like a art canvas or something like that for drawing on. And so what a canvas element in HTML allows you to do is actually draw on it and auto-generate things. In this case, we are using the canvas to draw this QR code to generate our QR code image. And so if you've never worked with Canvas, I definitely also recommend you looking that documentation up here. And so there's all kinds of different references on what a canvas is and how you can use it. Mozilla has some great examples of how you can do things like you can create images, you can create different components on the page. That's what Canvas allows you to do. And the reason why I'm explaining all of this to you is it's one thing you could very easily just install this component, get it live, and you have a QR code. But it's very helpful to understand the inner workings of what's going on here. And I had a lot of experience with this myself. I once had a project where I had to build out a very advanced QR feature, and it took me a while to figure out everything that was happening. I really had to dig into all of these things I'm going into right now with you so that I could build out those advanced features. And so that is what we're doing right now. So when we have that reference, we're saying we're grabbing this div, or we're selecting this div right here, And then inside of the div, we're grabbing this canvas element. And let's make sure that we actually have access to this. So for right now, let's just print this out. So I'm going to console log this. So I'm going to say inside of this canvas. And this is also going to make sure we don't have any errors or anything like that. So inside of the console, if I type anything in and I submit the form, there we go. You can see we've actually grabbed that canvas element and now we have access to it. We can see that height value we set, the width, we can see all of those values, even that ID that we placed in there. We now have access to that because we were able to create the reference, grab the current value, and then inside of that, we grabbed the canvas element. So hopefully that kind of all makes sense on what we're doing right there. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to create a image URL. So let's create another variable here called image. And I'm now going to grab that canvas element that we just selected, and I'm going to call toData URL on it, just like this. And I'm going to make this a PNG image. So that is our image value. So we're essentially taking that canvas and we are converting that into a PNG image there. Next, we're going to create a link dynamically. So we're going to create an anchor link. And now we're going to work with the document itself. This is the actual web page document. And we're going to create an element, which is going to be an A tag. This is all going to be hidden. So all of this stuff that we're building right now is all happening behind the scenes. And then we're going to set the anchor tag. We're going to set that with a href, which is our link. And we're going to pass in the image value there. And then after that, we're going to call anchor.download. And then we're going to give a name to it. So for this, let's just call it our QR demo.png. So you could name this anything that you want. So say you were building this out and is for a ticket or something like that, you could have this auto generating a dynamic name even for the file name here. And then from there, we're going to say document.append child. We're going to place in that anchor tag. And then from there, we are going to say anchor.click. Then we're going to say document.body.remove child. And we're going to pass in the anchor. So as soon as we generate, we're programmatically generating an image or an image first, then we're programmatically creating a link. We're clicking that link all in this function so that we can auto download it. And so if you ever have to build this functionality in, this is a great way of doing that. And then lastly, we're just setting the URL to empty. So what that means is after we've typed in that URL in the form, we're setting that form field to empty. So let's see if this is working. Okay, so let's grab a URL. We can grab one of these from the documentation. And I'll hit download. Oh, looks like we have an issue. So it says DOM exception, failed to execute append child on node, only one element on document allowed. Okay, so let's see what I did wrong here. So we have the canvas, we have the image, anchor, and okay, anchor click. So whenever I have this happen, I just kind of start going down the line and I just start placing the debugger in there and seeing what we have access to. So at this stage, let's just remove all of those and let's see what the anchor tag looks like right here. So anchor tag, because we may have to create it a different way or something like that. We will see here in a moment. There we go. Okay, so that definitely created the anchor tag and it set the href URL. So at this stage, it means that that is working. So next, we're going to see anchor download. that one should work. That's just the name. And then document. Okay, you know what? I think I know what I did right here. So I need to call document body append child. And then, yeah, that's going to work. So what I was doing is I was trying to append the child directly to the document level, and we needed to place it on the body level. So let's see if that fixed it. Okay, grab this one again, and let's paste that in, hit return. There we go. That worked. We have our QR demo, and that all got generated. So that's pretty cool. We have now done quite a bit in just about 30 minutes or so. We have created our QR code. We have built it out so that we can generate it. We can pass in a dynamic URL. We now also have the ability to embed images. And then from there, we're actually even able to programmatically generate links that have the value for that image URL we generated and download. And all of it happened behind the scenes. So the user doesn't even see any of those processes. So hopefully you find that as cool as I do. I really love working on these type things. And we still have a little bit of time. So let's actually see how we can customize this a little bit further. So say that you wanted to do a few of the things that I've talked about before. So say you wanted to make some of these other fields dynamic, we can come here and set up a few more things. So we can say, maybe we want to set the color. We won't change the background color, but we'll just change what the blocks look like. And so we'll say we want to set the color. We'll use the default of starting off with black, but we'll be able to use any type of value we want there. And then for the input, we will just copy this input and change that to change the color, to set the color. And then let's see what we have here. And then lastly, this foreground color, instead of it being something hard-coded in, we'll pass in our dynamic value. Okay, so now we have this other field here, and say we wanted to change this and we wanted it to be red. There we go. That's working. Say you wanted to pick out like one of these colors right here. I'm going to inspect this one. Let's see if this will work. If we actually can pass in one of these. There we go. Look at that. So you can even pass in any type of CSS value you can pass right in, and then that is going to be rendered exactly like we had hard coded it in, but now we have something that is fully dynamic. And so if we create a new one, download it, you'll see that that has also taken in those values that we placed in it, and that is all working beautifully. So there we go. We now have the ability to not only set the URL, change it, and download it, but now we can change the look and feel on the fly. And you can do that with any of these other things as well. So say we wanted to change the size now. We can simply follow that same process. We can set the default size as 500, but then we can create another field that allows us to customize this. So that size there is going to be changed for the image and everything else. So if I create another form field, and this one is going to be, it's going to be a number, but that really doesn't matter. And so we'll do size, set size. And let's see, oh, it doesn't like that. Oh, and that's because input tags do not like having, they expect to always have a string value. So we could do a TS ignore, or here, this is TypeScript only. We could say that we want this to be a number or a string, and that may or may not work. Let's see. Okay, yeah, nope. I actually have a better way of fixing this. We're going to start with this being a string, just like this. And then the size here, we will say we're going to parse the int. So we're going to convert this value, whatever the value is, we're going to convert it into a number. Parse int. Okay, now we have it and we don't have any errors or anything like that. Hit save, and now let's go take a look. We have our default value, but say we wanted to change it to be 1,000. There we go, it's growing, and notice the image grew with it dynamically because we had it being exactly 10% of that value. And this also works with our download. So you click that, now you can see it's a much larger image as well. So that is pretty cool. And as you can imagine, every one of these values, and we won't go and do every single one of these, but every one of these values in this component can be dynamic. So you can set the background color. You can even do things like have the, you can have the margin shown dynamically. Any of those things you can set in a form, and then you can have all of that rendered out dynamically. One little trick when I built this out a while ago was I actually had two components shown. So I had the preview component, and it didn't have the size changing. So say that you wanted to have this on a page exactly like this, and you wanted the ability for them to customize the size, but if they did something like 2000, that really wouldn't be very convenient. What I did is I created two of these QR code components. One simply had the hard code values in there. The other one I hid so the user couldn't even see it. That was the one that took in those dynamic values. And then what it did is that was the one that was selected for download. So they could create one that was 2000 pixels wide and tall, and that was what would get generated, but it wouldn't take up the whole screen as they're typing out. So if you ever have to do that, or you're creating a QR code preview or anything like that, then you can do it this way, and you can set a couple of them up, have one be a preview, the other one the production one that gets generated. That's one kind of little trick for doing it.